In a country 3 times the size of Ukraine and Gaza put together, the world's biggest humanitarian crisis is unfolding. The divisions are more domestic than these better-known crises, and the international allegiances far murkier. But those international allegiances most certainly exist, and it is creating a context in which weapons and illegal gold are often crossing the border more freely than aid. Over 25 million people in Sudan face acute hunger. Humanitarian workers are being tortured and civilians are being slaughtered in what has displaced more children than any other current crisis. This week, their blood could be seen from space. Today, the spiralling crisis in Sudan.
Bloodstains so vast they can be seen from space. 2,000 people killed in just 48 hours. Civilians executed in their homes and shot as they tried to flee.
It's terrifying. The RSF are killing all the black people in North Darfur. It is systematic.
It seems that really only now, after 2,000 civilians have been killed in 48 hours, the plight of Sudan's el-Fasher is breaking through on social media and in Western headlines. But why did it take blood visible from space for the world to start paying attention?
If we don't act now, there will be no one left to save.
In Sudan, in the city of el-Fasher, 250,000 people are trapped. Half of them children. They've been under siege for over 500 days, with no food, no medicine, no way to escape. Starvation and disease are everywhere. And on Sunday, the UAE-backed rapid support forces besieging them, a militia led by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, aka Hemeti, launched their deadliest assault on the city yet. They swept into the city, seizing army positions, crushing defences, and carrying out house-to-house massacres. The RSF members also filmed themselves with people they had captured trying to flee. In one clip, scores of men are seen on the ground, surrounded by fighters who repeatedly call them slaves. The RSF fighters then shoot them. In another, fighters tell 6 detained men who are in civilian clothes but identify themselves as soldiers that they can flee. Once the men begin running, the gunmen open fire on them, downing at least 3.
On Monday, the North Darfur city el-Fasher fell to the rapid support forces after over 500 days of siege. Now 260,000 people trapped in the city have faced days of bloody massacres. And the assault marks a significant shift in the 2.5-year-long civil war between the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. These are led by rival generals al-Burhan and Hemeti. It began hours after ceasefire talks in Washington collapsed. So what changed that led to al-Fasher's fall, and what does it change about the course of the war? Later on in the show, we'll be speaking to Sudanese think tank director Kholoud Khair about the wider implications. But first, I'm joined by MEE's head of news, Daniel Hilton, to answer the here and now. Daniel, welcome to the live show, I think, for the first time.
It is, yeah. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Now, MEE has been working to verify what is coming out of el-Fasher. I believe communications are pretty much completely down, and that's not an easy task. But there is footage coming directly from the perpetrators of the violence. Yeah. What do we know? What can you tell us about what is happening?
So, as you say, communications in el-Fasher have been cut for many, many months. The only way that we've been able to speak to our sources over the last few months is through the Starlink internet connection that some of them have. That changed on Sunday after the RSF announced that it had seized the 6th Infantry Garrison, which was the kind of main army base in el-Fasher. And the RSF, meanwhile, was publishing lots of its own footage, some through its own sort of official channels. So we had drone footage that they released showing sort of dozens and scores of people fleeing the city, and then footage from within the army base where they were sort of celebrating and making speeches. Later, footage started emerging, particularly on sort of Sudanese Telegram channels of a more sort of brutal nature, where RSF fighters appeared to have been videoing themselves slaughtering dozens of fleeing civilians, or people at least in civilian clothing, and mocking and detaining them as well. My colleague Mohammed Al-Amin, who is a fantastic Sudanese journalist, and myself have been sort of going through them, trying to kind of verify the locations. Everything points towards the vast majority of the material that had been emerging on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday to be accurate, and unfortunately the most distressing images as well.
It seems just a few weeks ago, MEE was reporting on ceasefire talks happening in Washington. What went wrong with those talks?
Well, there were. So I would say, first of all, obviously Donald Trump wants his Nobel Peace Prize, and he's trying to ram through ceasefires and peace agreements all over the region. So they kind of looked at Sudan and like, okay, let's get some people together. Brought delegations from the RSF and SAF to Washington alongside representatives of 4 countries who were kind of sort of mediating the talks. The problem for the Sudanese armed forces is one of those mediators is the United Arab Emirates, which is the RSF's most significant backer. So they were sort of not really up for engaging with the UAE acting as a mediator, because they see them as a belligerent. Meanwhile, the UAE was really shutting down all talks about el-Fasher, sort of trying to kind of both sides the situation there, despite the fact that it had been under siege for, as he said, over 500 days. And in fact, when those talks were happening, the RSF attack on el-Fasher had already begun.
So was the US trying to strong-arm the UAE to make to be serious in these ceasefires? I mean, you said here Trump is someone who really wants a Nobel Peace Prize, sort of turned his eyes to Sudan. Was this a serious process? Was there real progress made? Was there real hope that these talks would actually come to fruition? Or was it always going to be the case that the UAE, a key agent, was not going to budge on an issue that was ultimately going to collapse the talks?
Well, I would say that there was some optimism that a temporary truce could be reached in Washington. Sort of everybody wants to curry favor with the Trump administration. But I think they underestimated both SAF and the RSF, and probably the UAE as well, as kind of sort of all parties who could spoil the talks and who could be quite intransigent. So I think that perhaps they were over-optimistic.
Okay. But it's one thing, the ceasefire talks collapsing. It's a whole other thing, el-Fasher falling to the RSF. I mean, I think to a lot of people it looked like SAF had the upper hand, particularly after they recaptured Khartoum, the capital, back in March. What changed between then and now that enabled the RSF to seize el-Fasher?
Well, one thing people often point out is the kind of material support that the RSF receives from the UAE. The UAE denies that it sends any kind of weapons or Colombian mercenaries or any of that kind of sort of material to the RSF, but the evidence is growing and growing and growing that, like, really they are sending sort of really advanced technology, such as Chinese drones. I think with el-Fasher, Sudanese in el-Fasher are always waiting for the military to come and sort of relieve pressure, and there were sort of the Sudanese armed forces were sort of advancing towards el-Fasher, but it is a huge country. It's really, really far away. And things like air supply drops were ceased after the RSF managed to start shooting down cargo planes. So the people in el-Fasher had been alone for a really, really long time. Famine had been declared in displacement camps outside the city before those were taken by the RSF. And I think sort of, the forces that were defending el-Fasher had no fresh weapons, no supplies of ammunition, and were living off the threadbare food supplies that the civilians were now. And it's, the sort of aid workers are saying that almost everybody that they're responding to who have managed to flee el-Fasher are all showing signs of severe malnutrition.
So there's a real feel of abandonment by the people of el-Fasher for the Sudanese armed forces?
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what does this mean, I suppose, going forwards for the future of the war, for the future of Sudan? Right now, the country is essentially partitioned. We're seeing perhaps the most terrible violence we have seen over the course of this 2-year civil war, which of course predates back much further. With this change in power, what does the next stage look like?
Well, for a long time, people have been warning that Sudan could face a Libya situation where you have two parallel governments, parallel armies, and it's sort of partitioned down the middle. And that kind of looks like it's taking place. Sudan is a very diverse and large country, but it has a very, very strong identity as well. And partition is something that nobody wants to see at all. Even Hemeti, the head of the RSF, has been talking today about how he will keep on fighting until he takes all of Sudan. But it's instructive to see if we look at other places in the region, like Libya, but also Somalia, where militias or breakaway state regions have had significant backing from the UAE, and there is a kind of sort of trend of the Emiratis sponsoring their agents or their proxies in order to kind of sort of divide countries and project their own power across the region.
Daniel, thank you for joining me here in the studio.
Thank you very much.
We cannot understand what is happening in Sudan and why it has been going on for so long without understanding what is happening outside of Sudan as well. What started as a civil conflict has exploded into bloody chaos with countless militias, ethnic massacres, and foreign proxy self-interest. Earlier, I spoke to Khalid Khair, director of Confluence Advisory, a Khartoum-based think tank, to help break this down. I started by asking her first and foremost what the fall of el-Fasher means for the people of el-Fasher.
Well, just judging by the first sort of 48, 72 hours since the fall of el-Fasher, it's obviously going to be quite a devastating time for everyone who's still left in el-Fasher. We know that people who want to leave aren't able to leave right now. They've been, sort of starved for more than 550 days. They haven't had access to medication, etc. So even those who are sort of able to leave, they're emaciated. They're not able to sort of mount the strength required to travel the, tens of miles to the nearest safe space. And for those people that are left over, it's going to be quite a, difficult time trying to figure out how they escape the violence that is being meted out indiscriminately against the people of el-Fasher. And when I say indiscriminately, I mean that there's no distinction made between combatant or civilian, between man, woman, and child. Although we do know that there is absolutely distinction when it comes to the ethnic background of the people left in el-Fasher, with much of the violence we're seeing being meted out against non-Arab groups, in particular the Zarawa community there. We're also, seeing that there's a sort of Srebrenica-style genocidal attack happening in el-Fasher, with the sort of singling out of men and boys to be sent, to God knows where, in addition to those that are being killed, in hospitals, in, just trying to flee, or in public areas. There seem to be absolutely no safe spaces for the people in el-Fasher, and no safe corridors for people outside, because even those who are, trying to leave have either been extorted, captured, killed, or sexually assaulted. And so it's a very, very difficult time. There's no sense that the RSF, which is not a governing entity and has never been a governing entity, will be able to set up the kind of conditions that allow civilians to live there. So it's a very, very difficult time for the next few weeks and months in el-Fasher. But certainly the first few days, if they're anything to go by, signal a very, grim, a very tragic turn for the people of el-Fasher.
Now, earlier on the show, we came to understand some of the reasons behind this particular development in the conflict, the fall of el-Fasher. But perhaps you can help us to better understand what is driving this conflict in the first place. What are the key causes of the division within Sudan?
So I think one thing to understand is that there's no single division in Sudan. There are many divisions that are playing out interlaced with each other. But some of the main ones that are driving a lot of the conflict, at least in Darfur, is the sort of decades-long grievances around the land distribution and land usage, particularly between pastoralist communities and sedentary communities. And today, what we see is as pastoralist communities mostly are, informing the makeup of the rapid support forces, and much of the people who are committing the atrocities that we're seeing, particularly in el-Fasher, but also elsewhere in Darfur. And the sedentary communities are those, landowners, farmers, etc., who have a lot of the violence meted out against them. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. There are some of these sedentary communities that are fighting alongside the RSF for various economic reasons and political reasons. But on a whole, we see much of the same divisions, social divisions, and much of the same patterns of violence, therefore, that we have seen in Sudan since the mid-80s. My sense would be that for them, it is much more the local drivers of this conflict. They're at the forefront of their motivation rather than the national level politics.
There is, of course, however, international dynamics that are also in play here. Certainly the fall of el-Fasher, the strength of the RSF could not be explained without the involvement of the UAE. Now, the UAE, of course, denies this, but is widely accused by other governments, by rights groups, of supporting the RSF by the provision of weapons, of funding, of propaganda, and much more. What evidence is there for UAE involvement, and how do we understand the extent of the UAE's involvement in what we're seeing in Sudan right now?
You're absolutely right. The RSF today is not what the Janjaweed was 20 years ago. They're far better equipped. They're far better resourced. And as far as the UAE's involvement is concerned, we have seen so much evidence of this really from the outset, pretty much the summer of 2023, only a few months after the war sort of came to Khartoum and started. And we have seen several, newspaper articles from the New York Times to the Washington to the Wall Street Journal, to the UN panel of experts on Darfur reports in 2024, and even just in the past few days, we have seen, according to the Wall Street Journal, that two U.S. intelligence and defense institutions, the Department of Defense and the State Department of Intelligence, have both come out to say that they have ironclad evidence of the UAE's involvement, even under the Biden administration, the Biden White House. But pulling all these threads together, they're very sort of obvious. Very quick Google will sort of let you know just how much volume, and as far as we know, of weapons that have come in. There are some OSINT analysts, open source intelligence analysts, who say that even in just this month of October, there have been sort of upwards of 50 flights of weapons from the UAE transiting through Somalia, a military base in Bosaso, a UAE military base in the north of Somalia, through Libya, through Chad and other countries close to Sudan, that have seen this sort of wave and escalation, if you will, of the volume of weapons that have come through. We also know that there's a wide variety of weapons that have come through, from Chinese drones to weapons, maybe some of them that are made in the UAE but use spare parts, for example, by British companies. The Guardian recently had a piece on that. So there's a huge body of evidence that is becoming, sort of increasing as the days go by. That show just how involved the United Arab Emirates is in all this, even as they continue to doing so.
And as you've just pointed out, that implicates so many more foreign governments in what is happening in Sudan. Yes, we are recording from the UK, where questions are being raised over the provision of arms to the UAE. This comes after British manufactured weapons were found on battlefields in Sudan, having been used by the RSF, which, as you stated earlier, has been committing what looks very much like a genocide. There is, of course, a legal duty for states to act to prevent genocide. Do you believe that should be enforced right now?
Absolutely, there should be an international involvement. But the world today is not what it was 20 years ago when the Darfur genocide broke out, when the Darfur genocide was was happening 20 years ago. We saw the United States come out very early in 2004 to say that they designated the violence as genocide, and we saw the responsibility to protect doctrine really kick in. That world now is almost completely gone. It's very difficult to see the United States, as it has done then, now push for the ICC to get involved, especially as the Americans' posture against the ICC is not what it was. It's very difficult now to see the responsibility to protect being used in the same way. In fact, it looks like we can't. So the only thing really that activists have at hand is pressure campaigns, mounting pressure campaigns, the likes that we have seen be reasonably successful in places like Palestine and elsewhere, against the United Arab Emirates as a key Western ally, and especially in regards to the weapons that are being shipped from the United States, from the UK and other countries in Europe to the United Arab Emirates that will end up being in the hands of the RSF and then eventually used to kill people.
So one thing that we need to see, one thing we need to see, I'm getting is you're calling for a total arms embargo to the UAE because of what is happening in Sudan?
I'm calling for a total arms embargo across the country. Unfortunately, we know that won't pass the UN Security Council because the Sudanese armed forces will stop that. There have been calls initially for a total arms embargo. There's already one in Darfur that is not very well implemented. And in fact, the UAE was arguably infringing on that UN arms embargo when it was part of the UN Security Council a few years ago in 2023. Since then, efforts to try and expand it to the whole of the country, because of course the RSF is not just limited to the Darfur region, but also the Sudanese armed forces has been using externally begotten weapons as well. Those have failed because of the Sudanese armed forces has stopped any serious talk at this UN Security Council of an arms embargo. But at the very least, the existing arms embargo on Darfur should be implemented. It should be enforced in as much as possible.
In many ways, what has been happening here in el-Fasher this past week, it's not unpredictable. There have been warnings about something like this happening for a long time now, about genocidal violence occurring, and many of these countries have not acted to prevent it. So in simple terms, final question, what has the global response looked like up to now? What should it look like?
The global response has been nothing short of pitiful. I mean, we've seen nothing but words, and even then, the statements that are coming out of the UK, the US, various countries in the global north, the west, whatever you want to call it, as well as the multilateral institutions, the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, that is the regional bloc that Sudan is a member of. All of those have been statements that are very toothless, statements that are, sort of speak about what must be done and what should happen, with no commitment whatsoever to, sort of enforcing any of those things. And more importantly, many of those statements don't even name the United Arab Emirates and the role that it has. And so it goes to show, I think, for so many of us, just how much the interest that the West has with the United Arab Emirates really trumps the sanctity of life of people in Sudan, the previously very firmly held to belief, particularly in the West, that there was a responsibility to protect. There was a genocide prevention duty on countries across the board, but certainly in the West.
For today, that is all that we have time for. But before we lose you, we want to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social media platform, or email MEELive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be back on your live feed every Tuesday and Thursday. Thanks for joining.